James Parrish was 38 years old, and until that Wednesday afternoon, he believed the woman sitting across from him at the table he built with his own hands actually saw him. He was a Baltimore architect, quiet, disciplined, the kind of man who drove a 4-year-old Lexus and wore no watch worth mentioning. Unaware he was worth $500 million, she left him for a richer man. A man with a leased yacht, a waterfront penthouse, and a commercial real estate fund built entirely on borrowed time. She sat across that hand-built table and told James he didn't want enough out of life. While his phone lit up with confirmation of a $312 million acquisition closing in 48 hours, she picked up her suitcases and walked out the door without a backward glance, certain she was upgrading. 2 years later, they went broke. Every asset liquidated, every illusion dissolved, and James hadn't lifted a single finger. He didn't need to. But in that moment, sitting alone at the table she left behind, he made a decision that would ensure she understood exactly what she had walked away from. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue floated through the Craftsman home's kitchen, its mellow notes matching the soft morning light filtering through the windows. James Parrish stood at the marble counter he'd installed himself, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the other swiping through pages of a development proposal on his tablet. The numbers were solid: $47 million for a mixed-use project in southwest Baltimore that would bring jobs and housing to a neighborhood that needed both. He'd grown up not far from there, in Cherry Hill, watching his father drive city buses and his mother work hospital cafeteria shifts. They'd taught him the value of quiet dignity, of building something lasting without needing to announce it to the world. That lesson had shaped every decision he'd made since, including how he'd structured his wealth. The tablet's screen showed architectural renderings, budgets, and timeline projections. To anyone looking over his shoulder, it would appear to be the work of a mid-level partner at a respectable architecture firm. They wouldn't see the intricate network of holding companies Roland had constructed, or the $500 million in assets hidden beneath that simple surface. James preferred it that way. The hardwood floors creaked overhead, Priya getting ready for her day. James closed the tablet and reached for a second coffee mug. He'd ground the beans himself, measured the water precisely, timed the pour-over just right. It was the kind of small, deliberate gesture he'd built their relationship on. Priya swept into the kitchen like a gust of wind, already dressed for success in a tailored blazer and silk blouse. Her heels clicked against the floor he'd restored himself, each step seeming to carry her toward some distant destination that didn't include this room or the man in it. Coffee, he offered, extending the mug he'd prepared. She took it without meeting his eyes, already scrolling through her phone. "Thanks. I've got that charity gala planning meeting this morning. Probably won't be home for dinner." James nodded, watching her movements. 6 years ago, she would have asked about his projects, shared her own plans for the day, lingered over breakfast at the table he'd built from reclaimed Baltimore oak. Now she occupied their shared spaces like temporary housing, a way station between where she was and where she wanted to be. "Sarah's husband just closed on that beach house," she said, the words falling into the space between them like small accusations. "Oceanfront in the Outer Banks. Must be nice to just decide to buy a second home." James took a slow sip of coffee. "We own the building your office is in." She didn't laugh. She never did anymore when he made that observation. Instead, she adjusted her watch, the one she'd bought herself last month after hinting for weeks about the designer timepieces her clients wore. "That's not the same thing, James. You know it's not the same thing." He did know. Owning a commercial property through one of his holding companies didn't have the same social currency as a beach house you could post on Instagram. It didn't photograph as well as a vacation home, didn't generate the kind of envy Priya seemed to crave these days. She gathered her things, laptop, planner, phone, each item collected with precise, efficient movements that spoke of someone already mentally elsewhere. As she swept papers into her bag, a receipt fluttered to the counter. James picked it up. The paper was heavy stock, the kind used by upscale establishments. He recognized the restaurant name, one of the new places in the waterfront district, where tables had to be booked months in advance. The total would have paid a month's rent for most of the tenants in his Cherry Hill development, but it was Priya's handwriting on the back that caught his attention. GF, Yacht Dock, Saturday. The letters were hurried but clear, like she'd jotted them down while juggling phone and keys, not thinking anyone else would see them. He slipped the receipt into his pocket without comment, just as Priya turned back from gathering her things. "I'll text if the meeting runs late," she said, already moving toward the door. She didn't wait for his response. The front door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet house. James stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the things he'd built, the cabinets he'd installed, the counters he'd selected, the life he'd constructed with the same careful attention he gave to his development projects. Miles Davis continued to play, the music filling spaces that used to hold conversation. James looked down at his pocket, feeling the weight of the receipt against his leg, his expression carefully neutral, unreadable. He picked up his coffee and took another sip, letting the bitter warmth spread across his tongue. The maple leaves outside the dining room window had started their autumn turn, painting the Wednesday afternoon in shades of amber and gold. James sat at the table he'd built by hand 2 summers ago, each joint and curve crafted with the same quiet precision he brought to everything in his life. Priya sat across from him, her posture perfect, hands folded on the polished surface like she was conducting a business meeting. 3 days had passed since he'd found the receipt. 3 days of watching her move through their shared spaces with the distant politeness of someone already gone. Now she'd asked him to sit, using the tone she reserved for difficult client conversations. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," she began, her voice steady, rehearsed. "About us? About where we're going? Or not going?" James noticed how she'd positioned herself, angled toward the window, giving herself something to look at besides his face. He recognized the technique from her event planning presentations. Create a natural sightline. Maintain composed body language. Control the narrative. "I need you to understand," she continued, "that this isn't a sudden decision. I've tried, James. I've tried to be content with the life we have. But I can't keep waiting for you to want more than this." She gestured vaguely at their surroundings, the craftsman home he'd restored himself, the modest furniture he'd either built or carefully selected, the life he'd constructed with deliberate intention rather than flash. "More than what?" he asked quietly. "More than—" She sighed, frustrated. "More than being satisfied with a partner track position when you could be running your own firm? More than living in a neighborhood that's transitioning when we could be in Harbor East? More than driving a 4-year-old Lexus when—" She trailed off, seeming to hear how the words sounded. James watched her, his expression neutral. "Is there someone else?" The hesitation was brief, just a fraction of a second too long. But in that microscopic pause, he saw the truth she was trying to navigate around. "No," she said finally. "This is about us, about what I need." His phone buzzed against the table. He glanced down at Roland's text. "Closing confirmed. BWI Gateway acquisition final. 312 lands in escrow Thursday." James turned the phone face down without responding. Across the table, Priya was still talking, laying out her carefully prepared explanations for why she couldn't build a future with a man she believed earned $190,000 a year as a mid-level architecture firm partner. He listened, saying nothing about the 3 holding companies Roland had structured for him over the past decade. Nothing about the commercial real estate empire they'd built, property by property, deal by deal. Nothing about the construction technology patent that generated 7 figures in quarterly licensing fees. Nothing about the fact that the modest life she was rejecting was a choice, not a limitation. "I need someone who matches my ambitions," she was saying. "Someone who understands what it means to want more out of life." James thought about his father, who'd driven a city bus for 30 years with quiet dignity. About his mother, who'd worked hospital cafeteria shifts without complaint to put him through school. About the difference between wanting more out of life and wanting life to look more impressive to others. He watched as Priya stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. She'd already packed, he realized. The suitcases had probably been ready for days, waiting in her car or at whatever temporary landing spot she'd arranged. "I'll come back for the rest of my things this weekend," she said, her voice softening slightly. I think it's better if you're not here when I do." James remained seated as she walked to the front door, where 2 expensive suitcases waited. He didn't offer to help carry them, didn't rise to stop her, didn't say any of the words she might have been expecting, about love or memories or second chances. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality. Through the dining room window, he watched her load the suitcases into her car, watched her check her makeup in the rearview mirror, watched her drive away from the life she thought she knew. For several minutes, James sat alone at the table he'd built, running his fingers along the grain of the wood. Finally, he picked up his phone and dialed Roland's number. When his attorney answered, James spoke just 4 words. "She's gone. Find him." The kitchen had grown dark around James as evening settled in, but he hadn't bothered to turn on the lights. The blue glow of his tablet illuminated Roland's email. Full background attached. Review at your convenience. James opened the file, the quiet of the house broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car outside. The first page was a simple profile, the kind of basic due diligence Roland routinely performed for potential business partners. Garrett Falk, 44 years old, white male, principal broker at Falk & Associates Commercial Real Estate. Office in the glass and steel tower overlooking the harbor. Personal residence, a 3,200-square-foot penthouse in the waterfront district's most prestigious building. Current lease on a 60-foot yacht docked at the marina. Regular presence at charity galas and society functions. James scrolled through photographs. Garrett at various events, always perfectly positioned for maximum visibility. Always wearing what appeared to be bespoke suits. Always surrounded by people who looked impressed with themselves for being near him. The calculated performance of wealth was obvious to James's trained eye. Every detail designed to project an image of success that would attract more success. 8 months ago, Priya's event planning firm had been hired to coordinate a fundraising gala where Garrett was a major donor. The file contained photographs from that evening. Garrett and Priya standing close together, champagne glasses in hand, both laughing at something just out of frame. James recognized her dress. She'd told him she was working late that night. 2 months later, another gala. Another photograph. This time Garrett's hand rested casually on Priya's lower back as they posed with other guests. She'd said it was a client obligation. Technically true, James supposed, though not in the way she'd implied. Roland's investigation had been thorough, as always. Credit reports, property records, business filings. The carefully maintained facade of extreme wealth that had so captivated Priya was built on aggressive leveraging and the confident assumption that future success would cover current commitments. It was a house of cards that had stayed standing through sheer momentum and selective presentation. James reached the text chain near the end of the file. A mutual friend, someone in Priya's extended social circle, had forwarded it to Roland with an apologetic note explaining that Priya had accidentally included her in a group message meant for someone else. The friend had felt guilty keeping it to herself, but couldn't bring herself to tell James directly. The messages spanned the past 3 months. Priya's descriptions of Garrett's lifestyle were hungry, almost feverish. You should see the penthouse view. The whole harbor at night, it's unreal. And the yacht parties, God, it's like stepping into another world. He just casually mentioned flying to Monaco for the Grand Prix next month. Like it was nothing. Meanwhile, I'm with someone who thinks a splurge is ordering the expensive coffee beans. Then, 6 months ago, I can't keep pretending I'm satisfied with James's life. I've been planning my exit strategy, just need to time it right. And finally, the line that made James set down his tablet for a moment. James is a good man, but he is always going to be exactly where he is. Garrett is the life I actually want. James read those words twice, letting their full weight settle. 6 years together, and she'd never once asked him about his ambitions, never questioned why a man with his education and capabilities seemed content with what she saw as limitations. She'd filled in his blanks with her own assumptions, and then judged him for the story she'd written. The kitchen had grown completely dark now. James could barely make out the shapes of the appliances, the counters he'd chosen for their clean lines rather than their luxury branding, the simple ceramic mugs they'd accumulated over years together, all the careful choices she'd mistaken for compromise. He opened his tablet again, but this time he pulled up the $47 million development proposal he'd been reviewing that morning. The numbers were solid. The community impact projections were promising. The financing was already secured through one of his holding companies. For nearly an hour, he worked in the dark kitchen, making notes and adjustments to the proposal. The file about Garrett Falk sat closed beside him, already ceasing to matter. James wasn't grieving. He was calculating, measuring the distance between the man Priya thought she knew and the reality she'd never bothered to see. Finally, he closed both files and sat in perfect stillness, surrounded by the quiet of the home she'd just walked away from, while his mind worked through angles and implications with architectural precision. The morning light filtered through James's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the dining table he'd built by hand. His coffee had grown cold, untouched beside Roland's file from the night before. He closed the folder with deliberate care and reached for his tablet instead. The $47 million gateway development proposal filled the screen. Numbers, projections, community impact assessments, the concrete architecture of progress he'd been building long before Priya walked away. His finger hovered over the email from Roland about her text messages for a moment before deleting it without opening it again. There would be no confrontation, no collapse, no deviation from the path he'd set years ago. He made a single call to Roland: move forward with everything as planned, all of it. The next 2 years unfolded with architectural precision. The BWI Gateway development broke ground on a crisp autumn morning, James standing quietly at the edge of the ceremonial photo, while local officials praised the project's vision for mixed-income housing and minority-owned business spaces. He didn't need to be in the center of the frame. The building would speak for itself, his calendar filled with purposeful movement, board meetings where his measured voice carried subtle authority, site visits where he walked unfinished floors, checking angles and sight lines personally, regular dinners with Nadine at their usual corner table in the bistro where they'd been meeting for 20 years. "You're not just surviving," Nadine observed one evening, studying him over her wine glass. "You're building something bigger." James nodded, his slight smile acknowledging what she'd always understood about him without requiring explanation. "The foundation was already there," he said quietly. "Now I'm just building up." The Ghana trip came 8 months after Priya left. James spent 2 weeks moving between meetings in Accra, connecting with diaspora investors who recognized in him the same quiet certainty they carried. He returned with 2 major equity partnerships that would reshape Baltimore's skyline, though the press releases mentioned only the architectural firm's involvement, not the holding companies that actually controlled the capital. His mother called regularly, never mentioning Priya, but always ending their conversations the same way. "You sound steady, baby." It wasn't a question. Henrietta Parrish had raised a son who knew how to build through storms. The Architecture magazine's request for a profile came as his 50th building neared completion. James had declined similar requests for years, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But something had shifted. The time for invisible foundations had passed. He accepted the interview on one condition: full disclosure of his holdings, published under his real name. The reporter, caught off guard by his directness, asked why now. "Because truth has its own timeline," James replied, then turned the conversation back to the technical specifications of his latest project. Nadine read the draft profile over dinner, her sharp legal mind catching details others might miss. "This is going to change things," she said, not looking up from the pages. "You're sure?" James considered the skyline visible through the restaurant window, the clean lines of buildings he'd shaped, the communities he'd helped strengthen, the legacy he'd built while others assumed he was standing still. "I'm sure," he said simply. The days continued their steady rhythm. James reviewed plans, walked construction sites, and built 3 more tables in his workshop. He never posted on social media. He never spoke Priya's name. The work was enough. In his office on a clear spring morning, the final proof of the magazine profile landed on his desk. The headline read clean and direct: James Aurelius Parrish, the quiet architect of black wealth. Below it, the number that Priya had never thought to ask about: $500 million in holdings across 3 companies. James stood at his office window. Baltimore's familiar horizon stretched before him. Buildings he'd designed caught the morning light. Communities he'd helped strengthen buzzed with everyday life. Streets he'd grown up on flowed into neighborhoods he'd helped transform. He picked up his pen and signed the approval for publication, his signature as understated and final as everything else he'd built. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Baltimore Harbor Hotel's restaurant, where Priya moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Her event planning firm's latest client breakfast was running smoothly, though the strain showed in the slight tightness around her eyes. 3 cancellations in the past month, all with polite, vague explanations that somehow felt connected to Garrett's increasingly public financial troubles. She paused to adjust a centerpiece, her designer watch, last year's gift from Garrett, feeling heavier on her wrist these days. The breakfast crowd was thinning out, business executives heading to their morning meetings, leaving behind half-empty coffee cups and scattered newspapers. At a recently vacated table, a glossy magazine caught her eye. The Architecture and Development Quarterly wasn't her usual reading material, but something made her reach for it. Maybe it was the clean lines of the building on the cover, or perhaps just the need for a moment's distraction from the constant calculations of keeping her business afloat. Then she saw his name: James Aurelius Parrish, the quiet architect of black wealth. Her fingers went numb around the magazine's edges. The headline figure jumped out at her like an accusation: $500 million in holdings across 3 companies, strategic acquisitions, patent holdings, equity partnerships, a carefully constructed empire hidden in plain sight. She sank into the vacant chair, her clipboard forgotten on the table. The first paragraph described James's latest development project, a $47 million mixed-use complex that would reshape Southwest Baltimore. She read it again, and again. The words refused to align with the man she thought she'd known, the man she'd left because she believed he lacked ambition. Her coffee sat untouched, growing cold beside the magazine as she turned pages with trembling hands. There were photos she'd never seen: James in a boardroom, his quiet authority evident even in still images; James on a construction site, discussing plans with contractors; James shaking hands with international investors in Ghana. The article quoted him directly: "Success doesn't need a spotlight to grow. Sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones you can't see. Her throat tightened. How many times had he tried to tell her? In his own way? The building her office was in. The quiet investments. The patient, steady work she'd mistaken for complacency. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy as she dialed Daphne's number. Her best friend answered on the third ring. "Daph," she managed, her voice barely steady. "Are you somewhere you can talk?" "What's wrong?" "James. There's an article. He was worth—" She swallowed hard. "Daphne, I had no idea." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. When Daphne finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Did you ask?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had spent 6 years beside him, sharing his bed, eating at the table he built by hand, and she had never once looked past the surface he presented. Never questioned why a mid-level architect could own her office building. Never wondered about those quiet phone calls with Roland. She had no answer for Daphne. The line hummed with unspoken judgment. Across town, in his corner office overlooking the harbor, James set down his coffee cup as his sister Waverly's name lit up his phone screen. He answered with his usual economy of words. "Morning. You need to hear this," Waverly said, her journalist's instincts evident in her tone. "My source at the financial desk just confirmed. Garrett Fawkes' commercial real estate fund is imploding. Complete structural failure." James listened as she laid out the details. Over-leveraged positions unwinding. 3 major investors filing suits alleging misrepresented returns. Personal assets being liquidated to cover margin calls. The penthouse he'd used to impress clients, including Priya, was already listed with a premium broker. The 60-foot yacht had been seized by the lender that morning. "The whole house of cards is coming down," Waverly finished. "Nobody moved against him. Nobody had to. His own choices did the work." James absorbed this information with the same quiet focus he brought to studying architectural plans. He finished the last bite of his breakfast, set his fork down precisely on the empty plate. "Thank you," he said simply. After hanging up, he looked out at the Baltimore skyline. His skyline, though few knew the full extent of his influence on its shape. He picked up his phone again and dialed Roland's number. When his attorney answered, James spoke just 2 words. "Now, let's begin." The morning sun cast long shadows across James's office as Roland entered, carrying a leather portfolio that looked heavier than usual. James recognized the set of his attorney's shoulders. Roland carried information the way other men carried weapons, with precise awareness of its weight. "Good morning," Roland said, settling into the chair across from James's desk. He opened the portfolio with methodical care. "There's more than you asked for." James leaned back slightly, his expression neutral. "Show me." Roland extracted 2 manila folders, laying them side by side on the polished desk surface. The first contains records of legal consultations Priya initiated 4 months before she left. 2 meetings with Caroline Bennett at Hardwick Family Law. James's fingers remained still on his desk, but something flickered briefly behind his eyes. Family law? Yes. Roland opened the first folder, revealing detailed billing records and meeting notes obtained through his firm's extensive network. She was investigating potential claims to your assets under common law cohabitation provisions. The silence in the room grew denser as James absorbed this information. Roland continued, his tone maintaining its professional neutrality. Bennett advised her that given our holding structure, the 3 separate companies, the careful documentation of all shared expenses, the maintained separation of assets, she had no viable claim to anything beyond what was explicitly shared. James's gaze fixed on a specific detail in the records. When did she receive this confirmation? 6 weeks before she ended your relationship. The weight of that timing settled between them. James stood, walking to the window that overlooked the harbor. The morning light caught the glass and steel of buildings he owned through channels Priya had never understood. Or rather, had understood. Too late. She didn't leave because she underestimated me, James said quietly. No, Roland confirmed. She left because she confirmed she couldn't take anything with her. James turned back to face his desk. What's in the second folder? Roland opened it with the same precise care. Emails, specifically an exchange between Priya and Daphne from 2 years before she left. We found it while conducting standard due diligence on the holding company's potential vulnerabilities. He slid a printed email across the desk. James picked it up, his expression unchanging as he read, Daph, need your help with something quiet. Can you pull whatever public records you can find on James? Tax returns, property records, anything that shows what he actually has. I've tried, but there's nothing beyond the firm financials. Starting to think this isn't going to be what I need. Long term. P. Daphne's response was brief. Nothing shows up in standard searches. Either he's exactly what he seems or he's got good lawyers. What are you thinking? Priya's final reply made James's jaw tighten imperceptibly. He's never going to be what I need. I'm just waiting for the right moment. The timestamp, Roland said quietly. 2 years and 4 months before she left. James set the email down with careful precision. She was performing love while planning her exit. For almost 3 years. Yes. James walked back to the window. Below, morning traffic moved through streets he had helped reshape. Past buildings whose true ownership was hidden beneath layers of careful legal architecture. The skyline before him was a testament to patient building, to the power of understanding that true worth rarely announced itself. She lived in our home, he said, his voice level. Slept in our bed. Ate at the table I built. All while running parallel calculations I never saw. Roland waited, knowing James well enough to recognize when he was assembling pieces into a structure. The magazine profile comes out next week, James said finally. Yes, full disclosure of holdings, as you requested. And the development conference gala? The evening after publication. Guest list is confirmed. James nodded once, his reflection barely visible in the tinted glass. The sun had risen fully now, burning away the morning haze, bringing the city's edges into sharp focus. He turned back to Roland, his decision already crystallized into architecture. She will see exactly what she walked away from, not through cruelty, through clarity. Every asset, every holding, every piece of what was within her reach, all of it documented, public, undeniable. Roland began gathering the folders with practiced efficiency. How do you want to proceed? Let the magazine publish. Let the gala proceed. Let every revelation arrive through legitimate channels. James returned to his desk, his movements measured. We won't engineer her collapse. We'll simply ensure she has a clear view of everything she calculated incorrectly. Roland nodded once, understanding that James's restraint was not mercy, it was precision. The truth, properly revealed, would do more damage than any engineered revenge. The morning light streamed across James's desk, catching the edge of the email still lying there. The timestamp stared up at him. 2 years, 4 months, 12 days before she walked out. The beginning of an end she had planned while still sharing his life. James sat in his darkened living room that evening, phone in hand, considering his next moves with the same careful precision he applied to architectural planning. He dialed Nadine's number, knowing she would still be awake. James? Her voice carried the warmth of 20 years' friendship. I need to tell you something, he said. Do you have time? For you? Always. He started from the beginning. The receipt he found, the way Priya left, what Roland discovered today. His voice remained steady as he detailed the family law consultations, the calculated timing, the email chain that revealed 3 years of private exit planning while she shared his life. Nadine listened without interruption, her silence on the other end of the line holding space for each revelation. When he finished, she took a measured breath before speaking. What do you need? The simplicity of her question, no judgment, no forced comfort, just pure readiness to act, reminded him why their friendship had endured for 2 decades. "The magazine profile is coming out next week," he said. "They're hosting a gala. I want you there with me." "Done," she said without hesitation. "What else?" He outlined his strategy. Not revenge, but revelation. Clean, clear, through legitimate channels. Nadine understood immediately. She had always understood him. After hanging up, James called Waverly. His sister answered on the second ring, her journalist's instincts already alert at the unusual evening call. "Wave," he said, "I need you at an event next week." Not as press, as family. He gave her enough of the story for context. Priya's calculated departure, Roland's discoveries, the upcoming profile and gala. Waverly, who had watched their relationship with quiet reservations she never voiced, listened intently. "Just be there," he finished. "That's all I need." "I'll be there," she said immediately. "You know that." James made one final call, to Marcus Chen at the Architecture magazine, accepting the gala invitation. During the conversation, he mentioned casually that they might want to consider local event planning talent for the coordination. He knew how these things worked. The magazine would reach out to established firms in their network. Priya's company would receive an invitation that appeared entirely routine. While James orchestrated these pieces, across town, Priya sat at her kitchen table, staring at investment documents she wished she had read more carefully before committing her savings. Garrett had presented it as a sure thing, a way to stabilize his position while the civil suits worked through the system. Now those suits were spreading across financial news headlines, and her money was gone, converted into worthless paper promises she didn't fully understand until it was too late. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had left James because she thought he lacked ambition, only to lose her savings to a man whose ambitions proved to be built on sand. James drove through familiar streets to Cherry Hill, where his mother's porch light still glowed welcome in the evening darkness. Henrietta was waiting in the kitchen, a plate of food already prepared, as if she had known he was coming. He sat at her table, not the one he built, but the one his father had bought with overtime pay 20 years ago, and told her everything. The receipt, the leaving, the family law consultation, the 3 years of planning while sharing his home, Roland's discoveries, the magazine profile about to reveal everything Priya never bothered to see. Henrietta listened with the quiet intensity that had anchored their family through every storm. When James finished, she was silent for a long moment, then spoke with the wisdom of a woman who had watched life unfold for 67 years. "Your daddy used to say, a person will always tell you who they are if you stop filling in their blanks for them." James felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. He finished his plate without rushing, thanked his mother, and drove home through the quiet Baltimore night. In his darkened house, he stood for a moment beside the dining table he had built by hand. His fingers traced the grain of the wood, reclaimed oak from a demolished row house, shaped and finished with the same patience he applied to everything he built. The same patience that would now guide him through what came next. He went to bed without turning on any lights. Tomorrow would bring its own illumination. The waterfront venue glowed against the Baltimore harbor, its windows reflecting the city lights like scattered stars. James adjusted his tie, a subtle gray silk that complemented his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, as he stepped from the car. Nadine emerged after him, resplendent in midnight blue, her presence beside him both protective and celebratory. Camera flashes sparked at the entrance. James moved through them with the same quiet confidence he brought to every boardroom, every construction site, every moment that had built his empire. This was his first public photograph in 2 years, and he wore that fact as comfortably as his suit. The venue's interior was transformed. Soaring ceilings draped with subtle lighting, tables dressed in crisp linens, architectural renderings of his projects displayed with museum precision. James recognized Priya's signature touches in the details, the floating candles, the precise spacing of the place settings, the way the lighting created intimate spaces within the grand room. She had always been excellent at her work. That part had never been the question. Waverley caught his eye from across the room, already in position near the magazine's editorial team. She gave him a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried 20 years of shared understanding. She was here as his sister tonight, not as press, and that distinction showed in her elegant dress and relaxed posture. James moved through the early conversations with practiced ease. A federal judge wanted to discuss affordable housing initiatives. Two developers sought his input on community engagement strategies. He answered their questions with the same measured attention he gave every professional interaction, neither hiding from nor flaunting his newly public profile. 40 minutes into the event, during a discussion with two city council members and the director of a prominent education foundation about his upcoming mixed-income development, James felt the shift in the room's energy. He didn't need to turn to know Priya had spotted him. He could see her in his peripheral vision, moving through the crowd with her coordinator's clipboard, her designer dress a shade of deep green that caught the light. She was working, professional, but her eyes kept finding their way back to him. The way she watched him now, trying to reconcile the man she left with the man the magazine revealed, was exactly what he had anticipated. Their gravitational pull toward the bar happened naturally, inevitably, like the slow collision of tides. James arrived second, deliberate in his timing. "You knew," Priya said. Her voice carried the weight of 2 years of miscalculation. James turned to face her fully. "What did I know? That you were—" She paused, recalibrated. "That the article was going to—" "I approved the article," he said simply. "I didn't approve your invitation." That was the magazine. The clarity of this distinction seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She shifted her clipboard, a nervous gesture he recognized from their years together. "James, I want you to know that She steadied herself. "What I said, when I left, I was wrong. About what I thought I knew about your life. About what I thought you wanted." James looked at her with an expression that held neither cruelty nor warmth. It was the look of a man who had moved beyond the need for either. "You weren't wrong about what I wanted," he said. "You were wrong about whether you deserved it." The words landed with quiet finality. He noted her sharp intake of breath, the slight step backward she probably didn't even realize she had taken. He'd seen that same reaction from opponents in negotiations who suddenly understood exactly how thoroughly they had miscalculated their position. "Thank you for your work tonight," he said, professional courtesy perfectly maintained. "The event is beautiful." He returned to his table where Nadine waited, leaving Priya standing at the bar. Through the crowd, he could see her remain motionless for a long moment, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Then, with the mechanical precision of someone moving through deep water, she straightened her shoulders and resumed her coordinator duties. Nadine, who had watched the entire exchange from across the room, said only one word: "Clean." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and conversations about future projects. James maintained his quiet presence, neither avoiding attention nor seeking it. When the last guests began to depart, he and Nadine made their way to his waiting car. The ride home unfolded in comfortable silence. There was no celebration, no sense of victory or vengeance. There was only the quiet certainty of completion. James watched the Baltimore skyline slide past his window, each building a marker of what he had built while she wasn't looking, and felt nothing but peace. The morning sun sliced through Priya's bedroom blinds, casting harsh lines across her face. Her phone buzzed twice before she fully opened her eyes, the screen showing 2 voicemail notifications. She reached for it with the heaviness of someone who had barely slept after last night's gala. The first message played in her ear. "Ms. Ashford Noel, This is Margaret from Riverside Holdings. I'm calling to inform you that we've decided to move our event planning needs in a different direction. We appreciate your past work, but feel it's time for a change. Our legal team will send the contract termination paperwork today. Click. Riverside Holdings had been her largest client for 3 years. Their quarterly corporate events and annual gala formed the backbone of her firm's stability. The second voicemail was Garrett, his voice tight with the false casualness of desperation. "Hey, babe. Quick thing. I need to cover this payment by end of business today. Just temporary. Should have it back to you by next week. Around 40,000. Call me when you get this." Priya sat on the edge of her bed, still in her dress from the gala, and felt the world tilting beneath her feet. 40,000. After everything she'd already put into stabilizing his position, there wasn't 40,000 left to give. Over the next 3 weeks, the cascade gained momentum. The Baltimore Business Journal ran a detailed expose on Garrett's fund management practices. Years of marketing returns that couldn't be sustained, leveraged positions that had been precariously balanced long before Priya entered his life. His name appeared in 3 separate investor lawsuits. The SEC opened an informal inquiry. Her phone buzzed again. Another client email. Mastercraft Development was reassessing their vendor relationship. The carefully worded message didn't mention Garrett directly, but Priya had seen their CEO's face when her name was announced at last week's Chamber of Commerce lunch. She knew what reassessment meant. The penthouse listing went live on a Tuesday. Priya helped Garrett pack up his designer suits and collection of watches, the ones that weren't already seized as assets. The yacht had been towed the previous Thursday, repossessed by the lender after 3 missed payments. The life she had chosen, the world she had traded James's quiet stability to access, was dissolving like sugar in rain. Across town, James sat in a sunlit conference room reviewing final permits for BWI Gateway's completion. The project would reshape Southwest Baltimore's skyline: mixed-income housing, black-owned businesses, a community arts center. Roland passed him another set of documents to sign. Neither man mentioned the morning's financial news coverage of Garrett's latest legal challenges. Priya's third major client reduced their contract the following week. Her office lease payment, in the building she now knew James owned, felt heavier each month. She found herself calculating how long she could maintain appearances before reality became impossible to ignore. One morning, after another client meeting ended with polite uncertainty, Priya made a decision. She called James's firm directly and left a message with his assistant. "This is Priya Ashford Noel. I'm requesting one meeting with James. 1 hour of his time, whenever he can make it available. Please let him know it's important." Roland brought the message to James's office personally. "She called this morning," he said, sliding the message across James's desk, requesting 1 hour. James read the message without expression. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning. 1 hour exactly." The next day, Priya arrived at James's firm building 15 minutes early. The lobby had been renovated since she'd last visited. Subtle wealth in every detail, from the marble floors to the carefully curated art featuring local black artists. Her heels clicked across the polished stone as a security guard directed her to the executive elevator. The conference room they led her to was corner-positioned, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. James and Roland were already seated at the massive table, both in impeccably tailored suits that spoke of power without needing to raise their voice about it. Roland had a leather portfolio open before him. James's tablet was closed. Priya smoothed her skirt, designer but from 2 seasons ago, and tried to ignore how the morning light made every wrinkle in the fabric visible. The door clicked shut behind her with quiet finality. Priya settled into the conference room chair, hands folded carefully in her lap. "James, I know this might not mean anything now, but I need you to understand that I'm taking responsibility for—" James raised one hand, the gesture quiet but definitive. "Not dismissive, simply final. I'm going to tell you what I know," he said. his voice carrying the same measured tone he used for structural engineering presentations. "Because you deserve the truth of what you actually did, not what you told yourself you did." The morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the conference table. Roland sat motionless, his leather portfolio open but untouched. "4 months before you left," James continued, "you consulted with Patricia Winters at Winters and Associates, family law. You met with her twice. He didn't look at any notes. He didn't need to. You were investigating whether 6 years of cohabitation gave you any claim to my assets under state law. She told you it didn't. Roland's structuring made sure of that." Priya's carefully maintained composure flickered. The same flicker James had seen countless times across their dining table, but had always filled in with his own meaning. 6 weeks after getting that answer, you left. But that wasn't the beginning. James's voice remained level. 2 years before that, you emailed Daphne, asking her to pull my tax records, my property holdings, anything she could find publicly. The email ended with, "He's never going to be what I need. I'm just waiting for the right moment." The morning traffic hummed 14 stories below. A water taxi crossed the harbor. Life continued its rhythm while Priya's carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. "You spent 6 years with a man you decided wasn't enough," James said. "Then spent 6 months trying to figure out how to take what you decided wasn't worth having." Something in Priya's face gave way. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. Like a support beam failing after years of invisible stress. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't leaving me. The mistake was that you never actually saw me. You saw a ceiling, and I was just what was standing under it." He stood, straightened his jacket with the same precise movement she'd watched 1,000 mornings, and extended his hand, the gesture professional, final, clean. "I wish you well, Priya, but I won't be part of your recovery." He left, without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Roland remained seated. He slid a manila folder across the polished table. "The lease for your firm's current space expires in 8 months, he said, his tone neutral. "We won't be renewing it. Inside, you'll find information on 3 comparable spaces, all at fair market rate. We're not leaving you without options, but we won't be doing business together going forward." He followed James out, leaving Priya alone with the folder and the weight of everything she had miscalculated. 18 months passed like water. The BWI Gateway development opened to national coverage, a model of community-centered urban renewal. James's face appeared in economics magazines, architectural journals, urban planning quarterlies. Always the same expression, quiet competence that needed no volume to be heard. Garrett Falk rebuilt nothing. The lawsuit settled, leaving him with barely enough to start over. He took independent broker work from a small office outside the city, living in a rental apartment that looked nothing like the penthouse that had impressed Priya 2 years ago. His social media went dark. The carefully manufactured image of wealth dissolved like morning fog. Priya's rebuilding was slower, harder than anything she had done before. She moved her firm to a smaller space, lost 2 more major clients before bottoming out. But her talent, the one true thing in all of this, remained. Slowly, client by client, she began to climb back. Not to where she had been, but to something more honest. James bought a Victorian in a neighborhood he had helped develop. 3 stories of restored hardwood and wraparound porches. The workshop he built in the backyard filled weekends with the smell of sawdust and possibility. He dated casually, but made no commitments. He had learned to recognize the difference between solitude and loneliness. One Saturday morning, James stood in his workshop, morning light streaming through the windows. On the porch, his mother Henrietta and Nadine sat with coffee, their conversation a comfortable murmur. Waverly's voice carried from the kitchen, along with the clatter of what was probably too many pots for whatever she was attempting to cook. The new table was taking shape before him. Not reclaimed wood this time, but fresh maple with a grain that ran like water. He ran his hand along the surface, feeling the possibility in it. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.